everyone. This is International Master Bryan Smith with ChessLecture.com. Today I'll be doing part 2 of my series, King's Indian Masterpieces. And part 1 we saw a very classic game, Zeta versus Bronstein. I wanted to show some games that people probably wouldn't know. And I'm not necessarily going in chronological order. Obviously I'm going to show some other classical games, but this time I'm going to show a very recent game. This game was actually less than a year old. This was a game Chigilida versus Smirin. Now, Ilya Smirin is one of the top King's Indian practitioners of today, and the way of playing, he's created some very creative ideas, and this is an example of that. This game I thought was real creative, and it just struck me, and so I decided to show it in this video. This was from a tournament in Baku, 2009, in September. And his opponent is an international master, I guess, or player rated 2420, FIDE. And Smirin is black. So his game started off d4, knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, bishop g7, e4, d6, f3. So this is the Sameisch variation. This is one of White's main lines against the King's Indian. It looks a little strange, of course, to block the square from the knight, but this pawn on f3 solidly defends e4, so the black won't have any counterplay against that, and also stops moves like knight g4. So it means that White can put his bishop on e3, and his general plan is to create an attack on the king's side after black castles in a similar manner to in a dragon, Sicilian, or a modern, or some other types of openings where White plays h4, h5, and trades the bishops and tries to checkmate black. Now, it doesn't always work that well, and also White has other plans connected with trying to squeeze black, and especially if black creates weakness in a search for counterplay, then White can switch to positional methods. So black has a lot of ways to play here. You can see Perelstein recommended a system with a6, c6, and b5, and typically black should probably not castle so early if he's going to use this system. This is a very interesting line. It makes sense that black can attack c4 to create counterplay on the queen side. There's the old classical variation after bishop e3, e5, and then d5, and knight h5, just an example of c6 is also possible. A crazy idea of Bronstein's, one of his most famous ideas was the move queen h4, and after the logical g3, knight takes g3. Of course, if White takes it, he loses the rook, but White plays queen f2, seemingly just winning the knight. But then his idea was shown: knight takes f1, queen takes h4, knight takes e3. One of Bronstein's most famous ideas. Black sacrifices the queen for 2 pieces, and also a pawn. He gets a pawn for it as well. But he has a very solid position, and White's has, all of Black's pawns are united. He has the break c6 and f5. White has trouble making a plan, and the pieces coordinate well. So this was a very unusual position, and although he lost when he first tried this line against, I believe, Boris Spassky, this became a playable line that has been debated by top players. That's just one example. Anyway, in this game, Smirin played, after bishop e3, he played knight c6, the so-called Panno Variation, named after one of the top players of the past, Oscar Panno. I believe it was Oscar Panno. And the idea is, first of all, black challenges d4. At some point he's going to play e5 possibly and put his knight into d4. But meanwhile, he's also preparing a6, rook b8, and b5 to create counterplay on the queen side. This is one of black's sharper ways of playing, and this is what Smirin chose. Recently, the move c5 is very popular as well. It's a pawn sacrifice, but black tends to get good compensation. White can also play d5, e6, leading into a type of Benoni. But anyway, in this game, Smirin shows knight c6. Knight e2 is what white played, developing the knight and guarding d4. So now e5 wouldn't make a lot of sense. White would play d5, and his space advantage is really suffocating at this point. Maybe g4, and black is having trouble. He has no space. So instead, a6. This is following the Panno Variation. Black prepares b5 at some point to try to open up lines on the queen side when white starts the attack on the king. Queen d2 is a logical move, lining up the queen, preparing castling, strengthening d4, also at some point bishop h6. And now Smirin shows bishop d7. The most common move is rook to b8 here, preparing b5. And often bishop d7 is played later. But Smirin played this move. This is a flexible also move, which is a useful developing move, and black may play b5 as a sacrifice. And the queen may even come to b8. So this is an unusual line, and in some variations it may be better to have the bishop on d7 rather than the rook on b8. And he's got some unusual ideas in this line. So now white played knight c1. This is a very common maneuver. He's freeing his bishop, and also his knight will come to b3 where it's not in the way. And of course white also takes control of b5. So probably playing b5 here as a pawn sacrifice is not going to be enough. And now Smirin chose another strange-looking move. He played knight h5. His plan is to open up the bishop to attack d4, so he wants to play e5 and put his knight into d4, but he also is preparing f5. Now the first question is, what does black do after the obvious g4, just trying to chase the knight back? Is he going to just retreat his knight and try to say that g4 is a weakness? Well, g4 could be a weakness in some cases, but not after the loss of 2 tempi. Black might just use it to create an attack on black's king. So his plan, of course, was not to retreat the knight. He was going to use a typical King's Indian little tactical pinprick with the move e5. And the point is that there's this fork on f3 of the king and queen. So this is a very common type of tactical idea in the King's Indian. These sort of little tactics tend to pop up a lot because white's position is very overextended and black's king is safe. So here, white's play wouldn't really be correct, because if d takes c5, for example, knight takes, and black's threatening the fork on f3, so white's position is a little bit overextended here. Of course, after bishop e2, then black can just retreat his knight, and I don't like white's position so much. Black then will then play b5 later, and white's king doesn't have a very safe spot to go to. And d5, of course, is met by knight to d4, again threatening the fork, and white does not want to give up the dark squared bishop. If he takes, black takes, threatening the knight, and if white takes h5, black takes c3, and this position is very good for black. Even if he were to lose, here he could give a check on h4, for instance, and take the h-pawn. Even if he didn't have that, in these type of positions, the white's dark squared bishop is usually worth a pawn, at least. So that's not something for white to consider. And after g4, if white takes the knight, of course, black takes t4, forking and regaining the piece. And white's king, again, doesn't have a safe spot. Black's bishop starts firing at full power from g7. So this is very good for black. So, of course, he didn't play g4. White played knight b3, planning to control the d4 square. So he's actually threatening g4 now. Black doesn't want to have to just retreat his knight. It won't be worth the time lost to get white to play g4. White can still castle queenside. And after knight b3, Smirin played a very creative move. But there was another, and Smirin has played this bishop d7, knight h5 line several times. In another game against Bocharov from the Aeroflot Open that was just a few months ago, white played the move d5, and this was Smirin lost this game. After knight e5, bishop e2, he played the move f5, and his position was looking a little dubious after e takes f5, g takes f5, bishop to h6, and black's king is not going to be particularly safe, and his pawn structure is a little bit messed up. Pretty soon he played e6, and he got some isolated pawns, and he ended up losing. But I don't think that's the last we've heard of this line, and maybe black could play b5 here, which is a pretty typical thing. Now moves like f4 are going to be met by knight takes c4, or if white trades first, then the knight can come into c4, getting two bishops for black. If white accepts the pawn, black might get Benko-style compensation. Certainly bishop takes is not playable because he can take, and then knight c4 and take b2, or maybe take e3 and then take b2. So you have to take with a knight on b5. And this might be something that black could consider. Then queen b8 with some sort of Benko-style compensation. Maybe he didn't consider that this was good enough for black. I don't know. But it might be a playable possibility. And then f5 later. This is the typical type of stuff black does in the Panno, which is not one of the more solid ways of playing against the Sameisch. But on the other hand, white's position tends to be a little bit overextended, and sometimes black has to sacrifice pawns like this to get play. I don't know if black has enough or not here. Maybe knight to d4. You'd have to look more deeply at this line to see if it's playable or not. But in this game, white didn't play that way. He played knight to b3. And it looks very natural. White's going to play g4 and drive the knight back, and so he controls d4, so that e5 tactic doesn't work. Now Smirin played a5. This is really strange. Knight h5 on one side of the board, and then a5 on the queen's side. After a6 had been played, this is what kind of drew me to this game. It looked so strange, but these moves actually, even though it looks like two moves on the far sides of the board have nothing to do with each other, they're both aimed at the d4 square. Strangely enough, this is some sort of strategic idea. Of course, he wants to drive the knight back with a4. And if white plays a4 himself, then there's this hole on b4 that black can use, and white won't be able to castle queenside very safely. So that should be okay for black. So he wants to just drive the knight back. Now, white actually did play g4, and the game started heading into some tactics. If he doesn't, black plays a4, and then e5, and then knight d4 after d5 with a good game. So white played g4, and now a4. Of course, black had to respond. If he played knight f6, he would just be, getting squeezed, probably d5, or maybe just bishop e2. But his whole point was a4, to fight for the d4 square. And now if white's knight retreats, like knight c1, then again e5, with the exact same scenario as before, except the black pawn's on a4 instead of a6. Kind of unusual. So instead that's not very good for white, so instead he took on a4, making a desperado tactic. So black had to take the knight, and now white took on f5. And white has now won a pawn, but it's probably temporary. But now it's time for black to make a typical King's Indian strike in the center e5. He needs to somehow destroy white's center, and long-term white's king does not have any real safe spot, but of course if black allows white to consolidate, then white's just going to be up a pawn, and g takes h5 is definitely no good. So he needed to strike back in the center. And white played d5. He has to keep things closed as much as possible. If the center opens up, white king won't be safe there, and it's not going to be very safe on the queen side either. So of course white plays this, keeping the bishop on g7 shut in, and keeping things relatively closed. Now queen h4 black played. He needed to keep the tactics going. His position is hanging almost on a thread. Otherwise white's just gonna, it may be even playable for black to play knight b4. This might be a possible move, and then after h takes g6, then black can take back one way or the other, maybe with the f pawn with compensation. He's got play on the a file and the f file. But Smirin instead went for queen h4 and started some very unusual tactics. Of course, white has to just block with the bishop, and now black's queen and knight are hanging. So this was real unusual. Of course, if white just plays queen f2, black can trade queens, and then probably knight to b4 with a good game, because he's threatening many things. He's threatening a2 and also knight c2, followed by taking that crucial bishop and the a pawn. If a3, then knight c2. And black's always going to have enough play once he gets the bishop. So, for example, rook to let's say rook to c1. Well, he can't do that because knight takes and bishop h6. So you have to put the rook somewhere else. Maybe d1. And maybe take the bishop and then f5. And this type of, I think black should have compensation here. So this was, if white plays that, in-game should be okay for black. So white played the natural bishop f2, and now queen takes h5. And here, if white doesn't take the knight, black just has a good game then. You know, if he defends his f-pawn, for example, bishop e2, then again knight b4. And black has the open a file, and white's king doesn't have a safe spot. Black's king is very safe, and he has the plan of f5. The move f4 here doesn't do anything really for white. It just helps black to open lines after queen h3, and now the bishop is going to be open sooner. So that's no good. So he needed to take the knight, and now queen takes f3. This is real unusual. Whole start of the game. The first 16 moves have had first this knight going to h5, then the strange move a5, these unusual tactics, and now black has sacrificed a piece. He's threatening white's rook. White's threatening the bishop. So white could, of course, move his rook to g1, then queen takes e4. For example, bishop e2, and bishop takes c6, and they would have this position, which I think should be great for black. He has 3 pawns for a piece, so technically it's equal material. They're also very good pawns. 2 connected passed pawns, and they're supported by 2 candidates. So his pawns are very, united and strong, and also white's king is not safe, and his pieces are not active. So this is very unpleasant for white. That would be a very bad position, in fact. So he correctly took the bishop, and Smirin took the rook. And they got this unusual material imbalance. White's king, of course, is not very safe. And on the other hand, the pawn on d7 is a problem for black. The pawn may not last for very long, but in the meantime, he has trouble getting it. And the 2 pieces work together. It's a little hard for black to get his remaining pieces into the game. So I think this is unclear, maybe even slightly better for white, but very interesting. But here white played probably, I think this was a mistake, knight to c5. This was a tempting tactical move, attacking the rook, the pawn on b7 to support white queening. It looked strong, but it had some flaws. So it looks like better was probably queen to d5. And I'm not sure what's going on here. White protects his e-pawn, threatens maybe to take the pawn on b7, and if c6, then queen takes g6, queen takes e4, and maybe bishop to e2 or king to d2, and this pawn on d7 is immensely strong. Not king to d2 because bishop h6, but maybe bishop e2, queen h1, could be drawn with bishop f1 maybe. If king, it's maybe also possible king to d2, give a check, king c2. It's a very unclear position, and I'm not sure what's going on. Very tactical. This pawn, but the pawn on d7 is white needed to play this way. Also, there are other moves after queen d5. There's some b5 crazy move, looks interesting. If white takes on b5, of course, rook takes e4, followed by discovery on the queen. So king to d2, for instance, rook to e2, black wins. So can't take with a pawn. If queen takes, then queen takes e4, and again some more craziness. Then the rook has to retreat to a8, And I don't, it's very unclear. Maybe it's good for black. Maybe it's better because these pawns are very strong in the center. White has 2 pieces for the rook, but after white gets out of check, then rook retreats. So maybe not take the pawn on b5. But this is a very unusual position. Instead, white played knight to c5, which was tempting, but Smirin showed that this probably was. It looks like this was probably my white's mistake. Now rook takes c4. The bishop on f1 is pinned, so can't take the rook. And now white played queen to e2. The last couple moves give a strange impression, but he's guarding his e pawn. If white's knight takes on b7, for instance, then looks like rook takes e4. Followed by, if white blocks with the bishop, for instance, then there's at least rook takes e3 and queen takes b7. And black's probably winning there. So he guarded his e-pawn and attacked black's rook. And now if rook takes c5, then the tables would be turned, interestingly enough. Bishop takes, and if pawn takes, white castles queenside, and then this d7 pawn is a total monster. Of course, white's threatening to queen the pawn, and he's threatening bishop h3, trapping black's queen. So bishop f6, bishop h3. So black's losing there, so he couldn't take. So he played b5. But now the knight is sort of stuck on c5. White played b3. Black went rook c3. And still, everything struck me as very weird in this game. Now white's knight is actually hanging. D takes c5 as a threat. White played bishop h4, trying to promote the pawn. If he played knight to b7, black would probably just play bishop f6. And still the pawn is going nowhere, and I can't really, maybe this was a possibility for white, but I can't really find any moves for white, strangely enough. It's hard to find good moves for white. And black's getting ready to just chase the knight back with rook to b8. So he played bishop h4, trying to control the queening square, and black played rook to h3. This was a very brilliant maneuver, actually, I think. If rook takes c5, of course, d8 is... I guess this is what white... Yeah, rook takes, bishop takes. This was... black has some pawns for the piece. I don't know, maybe it's playable, but rook h3 was much stronger, leaving white's pieces hanging. He hits the bishop, and the main point is rook takes h2, and white's king is gonna is not gonna survive now. So white needed to. He actually queened the pawn. If there's also the possibility of bishop e7, this was a very interesting line. Bishop e7, planning to just take the rook and leaving the pawn for later. On d7, maybe stronger than just winning the rook for a pawn is to actually leave it on the board. But here, black has a very unusual line of play. Rook takes h2, and threatening white's queen. So white has to play queen to d3. He has to, there's no really any other good squares. If queen takes b5, then black has this idea of queen g1 with the idea of queen f2, queen d2, or queen f2 and rook h1. So queen to d3, keeping the queen in control of some squares like d2 looks stronger. But now black plays queen g1 anyway, and it's really impossible to stop this idea. If now bishop takes f8, then queen f2, king d1, and now bishop f6. This really weird position where black is down 2 pieces, white's pawn is a step away from queening, but actually white's lost here because there's no way to stop rook to h1. which will just force white to give up his queen. His pieces can't come to his king's help. The bishop on f6 always stops the pawn from queening, and other two minor pieces are also hanging. So there's actually no defense here. Rook h1 is coming, and then black's going to win the queen at least, with rook takes f1 and other pieces as well. There's no defense for white. So really unusual line is possible if white played bishop e7. Instead he queened right away. Black took, white took, now rook takes h2. Queen takes b5, white tried. Again, if he played something like queen e3, if he played queen d3, again this queen g1 is very strong, with idea of queen f2 and rook h1, and it seems white has no defense there. If he castles, which surprisingly he can still do, then black can take on c5, and then it looks like black already has 4 pawns for the piece and an attack. There's probably just bishop h6 looks strong, with the idea of not allowing white's rook to come to d2, so queen a3 is a strong threat. It looks like white's losing there, probably several different ways. Also queen f2 immediately would be very strong. So if white tries queen e3, then bishop h6 is real strong, and forcing white's queen to decide, so it can't continue to guard g1. And a nice line is bishop g5, bishop takes, queen takes, and now queen f3. And black's pieces are just hovering over white's king. Again, another line where black's down 2 pieces, but white can't deal with all the threats. His pieces are completely uncoordinated and can't defend against threats of queen c3, queen f2, and queen f1, obviously, and also just the knight hanging. So the closest he has to defense is knight to d3, but then black wins by queen takes c4, king d1, queen f3, and if king e1, then if you look at black's position, it already has this gigantic horde of pawns for the 2 pieces, and white's pieces can do nothing, but now just simple h6, and white can't defend this position. His queen has to continue to guard e3, and queen c1, e4 is just hopeless. So white's position falls apart there. The knight has to move, and then queen f2. So that's an interesting line. Instead, white's after rook takes h2, he's played queen takes b5, and now queen f3 again. Black is threatening queen f2, also queen c3, and there's turns out no defense for white. For example, knight to d3, queen e3, and queen to d2 is mate. Queen e8, bishop f8 doesn't do any good. Black still has decisive threats. Queen f2 and queen c3. White tried bishop e2, but after queen c3, he resigned, since if king f1, then queen takes a1, followed by mate, and if king to d1, there's, besides queen takes a1, and then queen takes a2, just taking everything, there's even maybe bishop h6 or something is probably even stronger, threatening mate on d2, but in any case, black has an overwhelming advantage. So this was, I thought, a really unusual game, and I thought I would show this as one of the King's Indian masterpieces by player Smirin. If you want to have an interesting time, if you're a King's Indian player, go to your ChessBase or whatever database you use and type in Smirin as black and ECO E60 through E99 and check out his games in the King's Indian, and you'll see some very creative and crazy ideas like this one. The knight h5 followed by a5. Now I'm not going to say that this is completely correct. You have to look into the d5 move that Bocharov played against him. But this is certainly an interesting game, and the black strategy of pinpricks is pretty common for the King's Indian. So this has been International Master Bryan Smith with ChessLecture.com.
This is Grandmaster Damian Lemos here for OnlineChessLessons.net. First of all, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you would like to receive more free chess videos from us, you can just click the subscribe button below. I would also highly recommend signing up for my free mail course, the 10 Grandmaster Secrets to Dominate Chess. During this exclusive course from OnlineChessLessons.net, I'll share with you my own Grandmaster shortcuts to effective attacking, defending, and growth hacks to improving your chess without complicated books or memorization. So sign up by clicking the sidebar on the right, and I know you won't be disappointed. Once more, this is Damian for OnlineChessLessons.net, and I'll see you in my videos. Thank you.